You remember the sound first, the metallic screech of the screen door slamming shut behind you on a Saturday morning. The air smelled like asphalt and cut grass, and the only instruction you carried was to be back when the streetlights hummed to life. There was no GPS tracker in your pocket, no digital tether, just the absolute, terrifying weight of total freedom. You pushed your bike to the edge of the driveway, looking left and right, the captain of a very small, very fragile ship. Once you turned that corner, you effectively ceased to exist to the adult world until dinner time. You weren't just playing outside. You were patrolling a territory that you and your friends had mapped out in your heads. We assume now that safety comes from eyes-on supervision, from a parent narrating every stumble and fall. But out there, in the woods behind the subdivision, a different kind of neurology was being hardwired into your system. You found your friends by the pile of discarded lumber, no text messages sent, just a rhythm you all understood. The mission was simple but dangerous. Build a fortress using rusty nails, rotting wood, and zero architectural knowledge. When the roof collapsed, nobody sued, and nobody called a structural engineer to assess the risk. You stood back, looked at the wreckage, and felt the first sting of a physics lesson you hadn't signed up for. Someone scraped a knee, the blood bright red against the dirt, and the group froze for a heartbeat. There was no nurse, so you spit on a tissue, wiped it off, and decided it wasn't fatal. This wasn't neglect. It was the raw, unfiltered curriculum of cause and effect. Neuroscientists today have a fancy name for what happened in those unsupervised hours in the dirt. They call it executive function, the brain's ability to plan, adapt, and regulate without a manual. But to you, it just felt like figuring out how to drag a heavy log across a creek without falling in. You were rewiring your synapses to view obstacles not as stopping points, but as puzzles requiring immediate solutions. That morning silence, void of adult voices, forced you to listen to your own instincts for the very first time. You learned to read the neighborhood like a map, noticing if the Johnson's car was in the driveway at a weird time. It wasn't just observation. It was a survival calculation about which yard was safe to cut through today. You knew exactly which neighbor would offer you a cookie and which one would call the cops if your ball rolled onto their lawn. When the older kids were hanging out on the corner, you assessed their mood from 50 yards away before deciding to approach. This constant scanning wasn't paranoia. It was a primitive form of data collection that kept you out of trouble. Psychologists call this hypervigilant social awareness, but you just called it paying attention. You learned to read intentions in a split second, interpreting a raised eyebrow or a shifted stance without a word spoken. Modern parents narrate these social cues for their kids, but you had to decode the signal through the noise all by yourself. Then came the 3:30 shift, when the yellow bus hissed its brakes and dropped you at the bottom of the hill. You walked up the driveway to an empty house, the silence ringing louder than any school bell. You fished the brass key from under the fake rock or the flower pot, a ritual performed with casual precision. The door unlocked with a heavy click, and you stepped into the cool, dim hallway, alone. There was no panic, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of your own breathing. You dropped your backpack, opened the pantry, and figured out how to feed yourself without burning the house down. You started your homework or turned on the TV, becoming the master of your own small universe for 3 hours. This daily solitude wasn't loneliness. It was the quiet construction of deep competence. Every afternoon, you proved to yourself that you didn't need a chaperone to survive the passing of time. If you broke a glass, you didn't look for someone to blame. You looked for the broom. You developed an internal locus of control, the bone-deep belief that your actions directly changed your reality. You hid the evidence, fixed the problem, and learned that mistakes were just logistics to be managed. But let's talk about the silence that came after the homework was done and the cartoons were over. You'd wander into the living room where your mom was folding laundry, the house thick with afternoon stillness. You'd sigh the two most dangerous words a child could speak in that decade. I'm bored. She didn't look up, didn't offer a tablet, didn't hand you a schedule of curated activities. She just pointed to the back door and gave you the command, go find something to do. That was it. No negotiation, no empathy, just you and the restless itch of having absolutely nothing. So you went outside and lay on the grass, staring at clouds until they turned into dragons. You sat on your bedroom floor and reorganized your baseball cards for the 3rd time that week. You called a friend on the landline, found out they were bored too, and sat in shared silence. You learned the hard way that boredom wasn't an emergency that needed a siren and a rescue team. It was just a signal, a dull ache in your brain saying it was ready to build something new. Modern parents treat boredom like a fever, rushing in with screens to lower the temperature immediately. But you had to sit in that fever, letting it simmer until the discomfort forced you to move. And eventually, something always happened. A stick became a sword, a box became a spaceship. This tolerance for the void extends far beyond those long Tuesday afternoons. It created adults who can sit in a waiting room without panic when their phone battery dies. You see them today, standing in long lines, comfortable in the quiet of their own heads. They understand that not every second of existence needs to be filled with noise or stimulation. Studies now show that those periods of understimulation actually grew your brain's capacity for creativity. Basically, being ignored by your parents taught you how to generate a universe from thin air. Which brings us to the giant oak tree that stood at the end of the cul-de-sac like a challenge. You know, the one branches thick as thighs, reaching up until the air got thin. You climbed it not because you were told to, but to see how small the cars looked from the top. You pulled yourself up until the wood groaned and the leaves thinned out beneath your sneakers. If you fell from there, you weren't bouncing back with a smile and a participation ribbon. Then there was the bicycle, a machine of pure speed, ridden without a helmet, wind screaming in your ears. You took your hands off the handlebars while flying down the steepest hill, just because it felt like flying. You jumped off bridges into water that was dark and deep, trusting your own depth perception more than a sign. You built ramps for your skateboard using plywood and cinder blocks that were definitely not up to code. And yes, sometimes the laws of physics demanded a sacrifice, and you paid in skin and bone. You scraped knees, twisted ankles, and maybe even wore a cast like a badge of honor for 6 weeks. But in those moments of pain, something crucial was being calibrated inside your nervous system. You were learning the difference between something that just looked scary and something that was actually lethal. You developed an internal alarm system that no lecture or safety pamphlet could ever teach you. You learned exactly how much weight that thin branch could hold before it snapped. You knew the precise speed required to land the jump versus the speed that sent you to the ER. This wasn't recklessness. It was wisdom earned through the direct, painful feedback of gravity. While other generations might freeze when the safety net disappears, you learn to tuck and roll. You understand that some risks are worth taking, because you've lived through the consequences of both caution and boldness. This is what psychologists call a calibrated sense of risk, but you just called it knowing your limits. Then came those weekends when the phone didn't ring and the street was quiet. Saturday morning stretched out like an ocean, and you were the only ship on it. You could spend hours in your room, building entire civilizations with plastic figures on the rug. You read the same comic book until the staples came loose, just to feel the story again. This wasn't isolation. It was the first time you really introduced yourself to yourself. You learned that being alone and being lonely were two completely different zip codes. The independence forced on you created a deep capacity for solitude that borders on a superpower. You see it now in adults who can spend a weekend alone and emerge recharged, not drained. But that strength was earned in the moments you'd least expect, usually when you were hurting. Something happened at school, a fight, a bad grade, a mean comment that stuck like a burr. You're lying on your bed, staring at the textured ceiling, that hot, tight feeling in your chest. Anger, embarrassment, the crushing weight of disappointment pressing you into the mattress. And here's the part nobody talks about. You couldn't text a soul about it. You couldn't broadcast your pain for likes or scroll until you felt numb. You couldn't even call a friend because your mom was on the landline in the kitchen. So you just sat with it, letting the feeling wash over you like a cold tide. You punched your pillow, you cried until your eyes burned, and you waited. And then, miraculously, the feeling passed, fading like a bruise. You learned that emotions are temporary visitors, not permanent tenants in your mind. This was emotional self-regulation, learned not in therapy, but in the quiet of a messy bedroom. You learned about time not from a digital clock, but from the agonizing rhythm of the television schedule. You planned your entire existence around a 30-minute window on Tuesday night, sharp. And when the episode ended on a cliffhanger, there was no next episode button to save you. You had to wait 168 hours to find out if the hero survived the fall. That gap between desire and reward wasn't empty. It was filled with a delicious, maddening anticipation. Christmas morning felt like magic, specifically because you had spent 300 days earning it. That new bike meant something profound because you saved your allowance for 6 months to buy it. Modern life is wired for instant gratification, a dopamine loop that closes in seconds. But your brain was marinated in patience, learning deep down that the best things require a wait. And when the waiting ended, sometimes you didn't even get what you wanted, you got failure instead. You struck out with the bases loaded, the shame burning your cheeks in front of everyone. You forgot your lines in the school play and stood there in silence while the audience shifted. And here is the crucial difference. No adult rushed the stage to fix it for you. There were no participation trophies handed out just for breathing air and showing up. The scoreboard didn't lie to protect your feelings. It said you lost, and you had to own it. Your science fair volcano didn't erupt. It just leaked vinegar onto the gymnasium floor. You got a C on the report, felt the sting, and realized the world didn't end because of it. You learned to treat failure as data cold, hard feedback rather than a definition of your soul. You asked yourself, what can I do differently? Instead of looking for someone to blame. This resilience became your armor for the complex, unpoliced jungle of childhood friendships. Picture the neighborhood park on a summer afternoon, a sovereign nation governed entirely by children. If a fight broke out over the rules of tag, there was no teacher in a high-vis vest to intervene. You had to be the judge, the jury, and the diplomat, navigating the minefield of egos yourself. You learned to read the air in the room, sensing the static electricity of tension before a punch was thrown. You became fluent in micro-expressions, that slight tightening around the eyes that meant you needed to run. You figured out the hierarchy instantly, who was the leader, who was the jester, and where you fit in. This wasn't bullying. It was a masterclass in human psychology and group dynamics that you attended daily. People assume unsupervised kids grew up wild, but actually, they grew up socially sophisticated. Because when you can't tattle to authority to solve your problems, you have to learn how to negotiate a peace treaty. Fast forward 40 years, and that same kid is now standing in a modern kitchen, watching their own child. You see your daughter struggling with a math problem, or your son dealing with a mean text. Every instinct in your body screams to swoop in, to fix it, to smooth the road ahead. But you don't. You hold back, gripping the counter until your knuckles turn white. You remember the scraped knees and the lonely afternoons that built the person standing there today. You know that protecting them from the fall is actually stealing their ability to learn how to stand up. So you ask them the hardest question a parent can ask. What do you think you should do? You prioritize their long-term competence over their immediate comfort, even when it hurts you to watch. You are the bridge generation, remembering the raw freedom of the past while navigating the safety of the present. You know that resilience isn't an app you can download. It's forged in the fire of small, manageable struggles. And when your child finally figures it out on their own, you see that familiar spark light up their eyes. That spark in their eyes is the sudden, powerful recognition of their own capability. They realize that the world didn't end just because they struggled with a problem for 10 minutes. This is the quiet, enduring legacy of the 1970s childhood. It isn't a nostalgia trip about how things were better back then or how soft the world has become. It is simply an acknowledgement that you need friction to get traction. You carry a specific frequency of calm in a world that is vibrating with high anxiety. When the GPS fails, you don't panic. You look up at the sun and find north. When the internet goes down, you don't freeze. You just pick up a book or fix a shelf. You are the last generation to know what the world sounded like before the constant hum of digital noise. That silence is still inside you, a deep reservoir you can draw from when life gets too loud. You know that you are not defined by your likes, your shares, or your digital audience. You are defined by what you do when absolutely no one is watching, by how you stand back up when the wind knocks the breath out of you in an empty room. The freedom of the 70s wasn't just about riding bikes without helmets or drinking from hoses. It was about the radical act of trusting a child to be a fully realized human being. And because the world trusted you to figure it out, you learned to trust yourself. That trust is the steel spine that holds you up today, no matter the pressure. So take a deep breath and remember the sound of that screen door slamming shut one last time. You survive the boredom, the risks, the silence, and the freedom. And because of that, you are ready for whatever comes next.